My name is Jan Harzan. I'm the executive director for MUFON. We are a scientific research organization that basically collects sighting reports from the public and then goes and investigates them. Our mission statement as an organization is the scientific study of UFOs for the benefit of humanity, and we have three primary goals. We investigate UFO reports, we promote research into the UFO subject, and we educate the public on our findings.
I start with this slide because it sets us situate kind of like our place and where we are. That's from the Hubble Deep Field. It's a several years ago slide. It's a compilation of many pictures done, and then like a mosaic, they put it together. It's supposedly one of the oldest areas of space, and what you're looking at in one slide is 3, 4, 5, 6, 7,000 galaxies in one shot. So all of them are completed galaxies. If you notice that you look deep behind, these are formed already. There may be some still forming, but at the age of 12 to 15 billion years, there's evidence of completed galaxies already formed. That's significant because the time frame of history is 5 to 6 to 10,000 years, depending on who you believe and what the story is. And of course, that's only history of our Earth, one planet that we know has life, in a universe filled with infinite amount of galaxies. We're going to look at this piece. This is something that some humans created, and it's a museum piece. It sits in the British Museum. What we're going to show tonight is the evidence, the best evidence from Zecharia Sitchin's writings that support his thesis. I was one of those lucky people that went on trips with Zecharia, knew him personally, worked with him on a daily basis. He was my friend. He was my mentor, my teacher. He was my inspiration. He inspired me to look way beyond anything that we've been told, to go around the world to search for evidence of his thesis, which was that a worldwide civilization existed on Earth that came from outside of this planet, in other words, an alien civilization. Well, for most audiences, it's hard to even imagine that UFOs are real, or they may not believe in extraterrestrials. This audience, I feel, has a little bit of a higher tendency to think that's true. But what's special about what we're going to look at, just like what Zecharia is pointing at, and this is in the British Museum, he's pointing at objects that were created by people thousands of years ago that have symbols, in this case of the zodiac, and familiar symbols that we know about. Because what we're looking at, and what Zecharia taught me to look at even more carefully, is the oldest evidence. Not the most recent, but the ones that predate everything that we thought was already dated. Because the older you go, the better the influence you have. And also, if you can track the progression from their history, thousands of years ago, to our current civilization, you will find a connecting piece. Like in a lawsuit or a case, you have a corroborating chain of evidence. Zecharia was one of those people who on Earth produced so much knowledge, collected so much information, and left behind a body of work that's outstanding. Over 14 books, published in more than 26 languages, sold over 26 million copies around the world. The 12th Planet, being the most famous book, has been a bestseller in every market that it's opened up in. When I was working with him on the website, we announced something like 15 to 20 countries in different languages. I couldn't even read the book covers, but that was the Polish one, the Russian one, the Chinese one. Most countries on Earth and languages now have published some of his books. So a lot of people always ask me, how did Zecharia get started? He used to tell some very famous stories about being reprimanded at school when they were discussing chapter 6 in Genesis that says there was giants in the earth in those days. Of course, the word in giants in English was not correctly translated from the Hebrew word. So when Zecharia stood up and said to the teacher, hey, that word doesn't mean giants, that means fallen ones. And we're talking about the word nephilim, from the root nafal in Hebrew, which means to fall down. Zecharia was reprimanded and told, shut up, sit down, Sitchin, and stop questioning the Bible. But he was never questioning the Bible itself. He always questioned the translations or the mistranslations, or the ideas that used to be a translation and somehow became a different idea. So from this incident at school, it started a lifelong quest to figure out, first of all, who are these Nephilim, and what other mistranslations occur that keep the knowledge and the true information hidden. And what are we going to find when we look at them? Zechariah passed away on October 9th of 2010. Zechariah itself is the name means remembered by God. We're going to look at physical evidence that everybody could see for themselves, and I'll tell you where some of these pieces are, because nobody should take anybody else's word for any conclusions. Everybody should come to their own and do their own research and come to their own conclusions. Zechariah used to call himself a reporter and a teacher, and I think I follow in the same footsteps, and I'll show you some of the different things that I've found as well when researching to confirm his original material. This is location Teotihuacan in Mexico City. I am on a pyramid called Pyramid of the Moon. Let me get this clear. Is that clear? Behind me is Pyramid of the Sun. They have a pyramid for every planet and an object for every planet that we have in our solar system, including little Pluto that's been kicked out recently. In this time era, when this facility would have been used, there would have been water filled through this whole system here and reflected up into the heavens. And at night, it would reflect the stars. Out of all the rolls of film, and I traveled with Zechariah to, Jen mentioned some of the countries, Mexico, Italy, Malta, but I also went to Egypt and Israel and other sites all over the country. One roll of film never came out, and that was photographed on top of this pyramid. This pyramid in Mexico, you climb on the outside of the pyramids. In Egypt, you can climb on the inside of the pyramids. Climbing up here was like losing your breath every step of the way. It's such a high elevation, you have to take a break. It is not easy. And I thought I was in good shape before I tried that. The significance is that Zechariah's thesis of a worldwide visitation on planet Earth, supported by ancient evidence, the most ancient possible, especially in writing, especially in picture forms, in drawings, and evidence left behind by scribes, by people who recorded knowledge and information regardless of what their career was. So I'm sure there were some artists there that were not scribes. But the scribe back in the old days was a very, very high position. If a king wanted to get out his information to the kingdom, and they must have spoken in the Persian kingdom, 10 to 12 languages, there had to be ways to communicate to all the subjects. And we will see some of them and how they achieved that. Along with the thesis that we had a worldwide occupation was that ancient man and mankind was helped by these beings and given knowledge and information on how to live and survive. Cultivation, farming, producing textiles, irrigation systems. There is a lot of information. We will see something in regards to beer. Yes, beer. The first occurrences of things that occur in the world, we're going to see much of. Now, we saw the picture of the amount of galaxies, and now we bring our story back to just one planet, our planet. What's funny is this is our planet right above the desolate moon. Now, it appears from here that the moon cannot hold vegetation, cannot support life, and that little blue speck up there is basically everything that we've ever known and heard about. More than 100 million species live on this speck of dust, which is 0.01 the mass of our solar system. Of course, 6 to 7 billion humans, everybody through history. This little blue planet is an amazing wonder of diversity. So then how much more diverse should the universe be? Back a few years ago when the 100th exoplanet was found and discovered by scientists, astronomers. The exoplanet is a planet that orbits a star outside of our own. When they discovered the 100th exoplanet in the Milky Way galaxy, which by the way is a galaxy that is 100 light years across, it takes light 100,000 years to cross the long side of our galaxy. They found 100 planets. They then came to a theory. Oh, we now have a possibility of 5 billion Earths. Well, when the number went up to not just 100 planets, now we're at number 740-something or 830-something. It moves so fast that I forget. Now the calculations are something like 30 to 50 billion Earth-type planets just in this galaxy alone. So why is it so hard for the general population and the media and governments to admit that they have visited us? The problem arises in the fact that they visited us in the past. If they visit us now, it doesn't affect anything. But if you admit to visitation now, what happens then about the questions of the past? how much influence did these beings have on our civilization? We're going to look at some of that right now. Then the question is, then what rules, regulations, and sins, and good deeds and bad deeds, and ways of living, and dietary laws and behavior laws, which ones of those are influenced by humans, and which ones were influenced by other characters? And the way we just look at the evidence and we weigh different type of evidence is this chart here, this slide here. The type of evidence that we're going to be looking at is type 1 or class 1 data. It's consistent and verifiable by others. It's predictable, it's scientific, there is something to study. You can see it and you may touch it. An example, what we're looking at, carvings, depictions, recordings, texts. If something was dug up by a university professor, put into a museum, it's type 1 evidence. There's something physically real. Well, guess what? After that, there's nothing else that's type 1. Type 2 is multiple witness testimony, but there's no physical evidence left to study. Shooting star is the example that I use. Everybody sees that we saw a meteor shower here last few days. You can see the meteor showers. It's not, of course it's true, but there's nothing left to study. That would be type 2, multiple witnesses. Now, type 2, for example, would not be a car accident with multiple witnesses because there would be streaks on the ground and evidence of tire marks and impact places. So that would take us back to type 1. Type 3 is a single person experience. Unfortunately, a single person experience doesn't mean that it's incorrect. It just means that it's that one person's view. It's something that was true for them. Unfortunately, in the area of UFOs, the class 3 data is a predominant way of viewing the contact experience situation, and that's what the problem is. If there's nothing to study, there isn't anything to study. All it is an interview. This is what happened to me. This is what I believe. Okay, I believe you, but what are we going to do now? You can't change the whole planet based on the story of somebody that has nothing to support. And then you have lack of data. In other words, number 4 is, I've never seen it, therefore it doesn't exist. I've never seen my car upside down, but on the news I've seen tornadoes and hurricanes and I've seen things flipped around. But a lot of people in the general population, if they've never seen a UFO, well, of course they don't believe it's true. And so how 40 million people may have seen something, but somebody else says, well, I don't care about those 40 million. I didn't see it. So that's evidence it's a lack of data. You can't study a lack of data. There isn't anything to study. The 5th one is intuition, a non-specific feeling. Okay, there's some gamblers out there. There's some lottery players out there in the audience. Some of you know how you feel it. When I was a stockbroker, I could sometimes literally feel the way a stock would move. People that trade, sometimes in Vegas, you can feel the cards or the wheel. It happens. You think of somebody that you haven't thought of for a long time, and who calls you? That person. Now, who thought of who first? I still haven't figured that one out yet. But I do test that out all the time on old friends to see who'll call me when I think about them. It's usually about 50% accurate. So there is an intuition that's real, and that's a real form of data. But what we're going to be studying, and the reason why Zechariah's information was so unique and special, and he had to take people all around the world to see the evidence of his worldwide thesis and visitation of an ancient culture, or a predecessor. This is a slide called the Clay Tablet Library. This sits in a museum in Turkey. It was taken by my mother-in-law. And this is the kind of evidence that is the stories, the texts, the descriptions in a text form, the writings. Based on how old the writings are, we're going to see how old an object is. These are literally a library shelf in a museum, but it used to be, let's say, in the king's palace. One of the kings, Ashurbanipal, used to boast that he could read the language from before the flood. The Sumerians created the first libraries, and the kings used to cherish their libraries. There's a famous story of Cleopatra crying when her library of Alexandria, Egypt, was burned. That was true. Egypt contained some or most of the knowledge of the world up to that time. At the front of the library shelf was a tablet that said, this is what's on this shelf. It was an index card. And the tablets were written in a form that if it was another tablet in the story, like Gilgamesh had 16 tablets, the Epic of Creation had 7, the last few lines would be the first few lines of the next one. So they would know what the next tablet is. So when archaeologists broke into these, they found some missing, they found some there. In another dig, they found pieces that they could match together. So they were able to put these together. Does anybody have an idea of how many total tablets have been found that are in this category of cuneiform script that cover Sumerian, Babylonian, Assyrian cultures? 1 million. Almost 1 million, and some people say more. And most of the tablets are administrative. They're transactions for us trading corn and wheat and sheep and maybe an agreement for a daughter to marry a son. They used to record everything on a clay or stone envelope. And this kind of evidence, not only is it physical and real, but it's also the original. This is not a copy from a copy machine. It's not printed from a printer. What you're looking at is what the scribe wrote. This is the original. So when the professors and archaeologists study them in this category of evidence, this is writing and the history writing, you're studying the original, not a copy. And that's very important because in a copy, a word like thou shalt not can be left out, and it could become thou shalt. So what you may not do could be something that you should do. So it's extremely important to have originals, especially when you're trying to find out what was the origins of things in civilization that we take for granted of that we don't even realize. And I don't even know if every one of these is translated. A person would have to go to the Turkey Museum, look through their catalog, buy it, and see what the translation is of each piece. I have a 3-set book from the New York Metropolitan Museum in New York that is through 2 or 3 inches each one. It shows you each tablet, it transliterates it, it shows you a diagram of it, it spells it out for you, and it translates it for you. And most of it is just these exchanges, transactions. People donate it to the temple for their god. Somebody was born and they put some kind of gift. But some of them are more significant. Like this. This is obviously not writing. This is a visual record of an event that occurred. The Victory Stela of Naram Sin. It's from the year of 2300 BC. Now we're 2000 AD. This is 2300 BC. That's 4,300 years ago. The king of Acadia, Naram Sin, is right here. He is leading a group of people. Now, one thing that's interesting about Naram Sin is that he's wearing a horned hat. We will see evidence that when they depict the gods in physical form, they always wear horned hats. It's the motif, it's the style. So when you see the horned hat, you know that they mean to elevate the person and make it the lofty person. Okay? But what's going on in this picture? Are they going to war against this object? Are they praying to this object? Are they revering this object? Are they afraid of this object? Above this conical object is these astronomical star-looking patterns. So what you start to see is pictures, stories, little pictures we're going to see in clay, in what do you call it? In rolled clay pictures you're going to see, and they're going to be depicting things that either they should not know or it's beyond their time, because in the year 2300 BC, there's information they should not have. Okay, this starts a timeline. Now this is a common timeline that is actually not very common. This is from the museum in Malta when I went with Zechariah, and what was interesting about this is most historians are going to tell you that the pyramids are the oldest structures on Earth, and the ziggurat of Ur is one of the oldest, but not on Malta. They believe they have the oldest. They believe that their temples are 3600 BC, and that's the date that they believe the Great Flood occurred, which also flooded the Mediterranean, the one that we know of from the Bible, from the Great Flood of Noah, which is written about in every ancient culture. So they have the pyramids here of 2500. 2000 BC, they have Stonehenge. They have Acropolis of Athens, the Great Wall of China, the Colosseum of Rome, 70 AD. Now, the time frame of us is 2000 AD. The time of Jesus would be 0. The time of Abraham is 2000 BC. And they're talking even 1600 years before that. Now, does everybody agree with Malta's timeline? No. But it's interesting that one professional group and one location on Earth has a completely different idea of the time of history. And so they believe their culture is 1,000 years before the pyramids. A full 1,000 years. They have on Malta 24 temples. 23 of them are above ground, and one of them is underwater now, because it's so old that the water levels rose. The 24 is significant. Also what is significant is the 3,600 up there. That's a significant number as well, and we're going to see why. Okay, now we're looking at what the Sumerian people look like. Most of the evidence of the oldest type in writing comes from the Sumerian culture. There was many different levels and many different variations of their culture that lasted for a couple thousand years. You're going to see how some of the differences are. All of these are humans that are normal characters of Sumer, except this is Gudea, one of their kings, the last great of the Sumerian Empire. And by the way, this was a piece that was in Zechariah's collection that was sold to somebody after he passed away. But the piece was available from other dealers as well. There was a resurgence of the Sumerian language when Akkadian was already spoken as the public language. The writing became Sumerian, very similar to how Latin was still being taught in schools 100 years ago or so. Latin was a big deal. So they had a resurgence of Sumerian in written form, but the language of the time was the Semitic Akkadian. And we're going to see how these cross things conflict with ideas and symbols and influences. Okay? And now this is where on earth the area is of the Sumerian culture. And it is the area between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. The oldest settlements are down here. And they move up this way through the history. Here is Eridu. Eridu is actually the earliest form of the name of the word earth. What we're going to see that through thousands of years of spoken language, the letter D, or the sound da, can become a ta. A Tammuz can become Damuz. A da can become a ta. A small little scribal error, a little flick of the wrist, and the sound changes. Plus there's natural changes in people's speech patterns that exist anyway through thousands of years of spoken languages. Nobody calls a cellular phone anymore. They all call it a cell phone. Most people don't even say technology anymore. They just say tech. There's a lot of words that get shortened as the usage becomes more common. Over here we have the oldest cities that are listed in the history. And where is Eric? Let's see, where'd it go? Is it slide clear all the way? Okay, right there. Nippur. Some of the oldest calendars were found from Nippur, okay, and Sippar. And there's the actual city of Babylon. And so these places are extremely important in the history of not only the Middle East, but the Bible history as well. The current calendar that the Jews use, the religious calendar, is from Nippur, and it counts back to the time when Anu, the chief god, visited the planet, and he came with his wife Antu, and they started a counting of one. Now, the Jews believe that it's the counting of the beginning of the creation of the earth, but actually it was the counting of that calendar's day one. A similar thing happened in Mexico. Now we have end of December 21st, come up with the Mayan calendar. It's the end of one cycle, the beginning of another, but that calendar started from day one in 3112 BC, happened to be day one, and then they started counting from there. But they had nothing to do with the creation of the earth. They just started a certain time frame and counted it, like now we're in the year 2012 from the time, allegedly, of Jesus. It was another counting that started brand new. But the most important thing is that there is tablets found all up this area. And this is not only going into Turkey, Syria, Israel, Egypt, Iraq, Iran, all of them. Tablets all over the place. And a lot of them were consistent. Okay, now we see the first actual forms of what writing looked like. Now what we need to get used to is looking at how writing changes through time. Scholars who study this have no problem because they're used to seeing it. What we're used to seeing is something like Shakespeare in school that we can barely understand now. Shakespeare wasn't around that long ago. I still can't understand it. When writing first started, it was pictures. We have at the top pictographic writing, and it's going this direction, and then at some point the scribe decides to turn it. So the word for earth, which is ki, which is the root of a few things, like some people have heard of Enki, Lord of Earth, or Mother Gaia, Gi, comes from the ki. But the earth was depicted sideways here as a little oblong, oval shaped, which is kind of unusual since the earth is like that. It's not completely round. But then the scribe turns it sideways. Then another scribe makes it from a picture to a little bit more cuneiform. Then it becomes a complete cuneiform symbol. So what happens is even the picture of a person in eating or drinking gets distorted from the picture and becomes a cuneiform scribble or image or a shape. So now there is a way to determine how old something is when it's found and in what language it's written in. What form of the Sumerian, Akkadian, or Babylonian is that tablet found in? That will determine how old it is. So now we're able to go back in time and notice that some things occurred before and some things occurred later. But as you can see, this is a pretty decent, complete list of just a simple kind of rundown of some of your common things. Now here's an example where it says mountain. Mountain is kur. In Hebrew, mountain is har. Ka becomes ha. That's what happens over a couple thousand years. The word har becomes kar becomes har. It's simple. By the way, a man's name, man, domestic person, us humans, we were called Lu. Just like the man's name Lu or Luan. Lulu, which is a mixed up person, is the same term the Sumerians used to call us Lulu Amelu. And Amelu comes from the Semitic, the word for people, which is Am. So they called us mixed up beings. You're going to see why mixed up beings when we show a few more slides. But we still use the Lulu term. It's just stayed with society for thousands of years. And here we have a diagram based on history and the different languages that were used and found at the time. The first one at the top before 3000 BC is Sumerio-Akkadian cuneiform. Then it goes to Egyptian hieroglyphic. And then the languages start to break up. And what you've got is branches in different areas. Okay, that's not perfect. And then the branches come, and then what happens is Phoenician becomes a predecessor to not only Aramaic, but Hebrew and Arabic. And Phoenician becomes one of those things that takes over and becomes a dominant influence. And you're going to see how it happens a little bit better. So what we have is you have words, anybody's language can be written, and anybody's characters set. English characters have all the sounds that you can make with the tongue. So you could spell out Russian with English letters. Okay? Other sounds are going to be more difficult in some languages, like the cha sound. Cha sound is a very Semitic sound. We usually do CH. Okay? Or they do an H for Hanukkah. So there are some sounds that are tricky. But what you get is this line of changes of words and letters and intermixing so that you can see how that original problem with the word Nephilim that Zechariah complained about was influenced by the Aramaic Nephila as giant. But in Hebrew, the word for giant is Anakim or Anak, which is more closely to the Sumerian. And you're going to see how that connects. And now we have the view of the Semitic languages. Okay. We're all used to alpha, beta, gamma, delta. That's really Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Daled. That's the name that the Phoenicians called it. The picture of the letters, this Phoenician pictures, that's actually ancient Hebrew. That's Hebrew script that's found, let's say, in the Sinai. Okay? Then the scribes later on changed it to a more printable Hebrew. And then the Arabs made a different little version, but the sounds are the same. Again, if anybody's heard the difference between Arabic and Hebrew, there's a lot of differences, but you can make it out. Like, some of the, not Italian, Spanish and Portuguese. Very similar, not exact. Arabic and Hebrew have a lot of similarities, but the accents are so different, it's hard to kind of understand it until you get into it. But all of the names and the sounds are actually coming from Phoenician. So the sounds of the letters and what sound it is, like Zion is a Z sound, is actually from the Phoenician origin, which also comes from the Akkadian root, which is the Semitic thing. And it happens to take a process of thousands of years to do this. This is not a simple thing. Okay. Now we're looking at finally some of the first that occurs. Now what you've seen is a progression of languages, of symbols, of timelines. But now we're going to go see some of the knowledge that was actually contained on those tablets, in this case translated by Samuel Noah Kramer from his amazing book called History Begins at Sumer. He first had 15 first, then he went to 39 first. All of these are the first recorded of things, of these events, these subjects, in the history of writing. In other words, the first time they were written down and they were found by archaeologists. The first time schools were described. The first time there was international affairs or government affairs, they were described. In this case, it was a bicameral Congress. That's what we have in the United States, a two-party Congress. The first types of social reforms, the first case of recording history, the first law codes, crime and punishment, justice, precedences for legal decisions, the first medicines, agriculture, horticulture, all of these, the first philosophies, the first ethics and moral ideals. The first Job was a character whose God is turned against him, and basically he's made to suffer, as much as possible. The first cases of wisdom, proverbs and sayings, and Sumerian proverbs are very funny, and some of them are old-fashioned, and some of them are very modern. There was some of them used to make me laugh. One of them was, man, for his pleasure marriage, on thinking it over, divorce. That was one of them. Another Sumerian proverb word was, a rich man can't sleep at night, but a poor man can. Because a rich man would always be worried about his possessions. And they covered, a lot of things that are just seemed old-fashioned and kind of unusual nowadays. Okay, now, for what affects us most today in our culture on a daily basis. The first biblical parallels, the stories of paradise, the first stories of floods, the first stories of resurrection. None of these are new stories. In any culture or religion that exists today, none of those stories are original. The man's first heroic age, first library catalogs, which I mentioned, first destruction and deliverances, the first messiahs. The Messiah was the ideal king who would come and save you from the despair of the invading armies and everything like that. And also, I mentioned resurrection, funeral chants, lullabies to babies. So many of their cultures came and existed, and I'm going to show you how we still use a lot of this today. It's funny because nobody's giving credit for Lulu being a Sumerian word, or for the mathematical system being a Sumerian system. Now, usually what I do on the slide is, this is our base 10 system. We have 10 fingers and 10 toes, so it makes sense we use base 10. They didn't. They used sexagesimal. They multiplied 10 times 6 times 10 times 6. They also multiplied 6s times 2s. It seems to be a little bit weird, but guess what? It is what we use today. Degrees in a circle is 360 degrees. That's 60 times 6. 6 times 10 is 60 times 6 is 360. The Sumerians invented the 360-degree circle. When you buy bagels or donuts, how many do you buy? A dozen? How many people know how to tell the baker you want a group of 10? What's called a group of 10? The baker's never heard it before. It's a deca. Oh yeah, tell him you want a deca. He'll know what you're talking about. How many months in a calendar year? It's 12, which is 2 times 6. How many Olympian gods? How many tribes of Israel? How many disciples of Jesus? How many zodiacal ages? It's all 12. It's all 2 times 6. All of that stuff comes from the Sumerians' way of looking at the sky and looking at time. And we're going to see more incredible stuff, yet we still use it today. 24 hours in a day, it's 4 times 6. But in the old days, they were double hours. They changed at some point. Double hours was the easier method in the ancient days of telling somebody when to pray. The morning prayer was done in the first double hour of the day. Then you skipped the double hour, and the middle one was done in the third, and then there was another one near the end. At some point, they changed it to 24. But when you're looking at the old texts, you can see that they're describing double hours, which was, again, based on 6, sexagesimal. So it's mathematics that doesn't make sense. If you're learning mathematics from a civilization that's growing up, from being a baby young, and it grows up at a progression, you would probably use base 10. This is a description of precession. Precession of the equinox is when the Earth's axis wobbles. And that wobbling creates several things. First of all, it creates the zodiacal ages. The fact that our axis is tilted helps create the seasons. Also, it creates the animals that were used in each zodiacal age. The amount of years of one zodiacal precession is 25,920 years. Every zodiac age is 2,160 years times 12. That's important because they had ways of describing the sky, and in those time frames, there were certain changeovers of gods, and they went to war based on these alleged changes in the sky, which should have created changes on the ground. And humans were brought into these battles and fights, depending on what side they were on, and, well, we basically were led around by these kings and god beings based on movements of the heavens. So right now we're in the age of Pisces. We're going into the age of Aquarius, and that's what the big song is about. The age of Aries, by the way, why does they depict Jesus with a fish? It wasn't because he was a fisherman. It was because he was the prophet that came at the age of Pisces. In Egypt, all the statues during the age of Aries are rams. The Jews blow a ram's horn when they blow the shofar. It's a symbol of religious ceremonies. In Taurus, in the age of Egypt, was all bulls. Egypt changed their architecture from bulls to rams. And then fish became popular. The Aquarius is the water bearer. It's supposed to be an age of enlightenment and knowledge being brought back to humans. Hopefully we'll see that happen. A lot of people think that the Sphinx is Leo, therefore created this time frame ago, from the age of Virgo into Leo. That's a whole nother discussion. Okay, now we see from one of Zach's books, from when time began, what name the Sumerians called every zodiacal animal and the age. So it wasn't the Greeks that came up with the bull. Guana was the heavenly bull. That was a Sumerian term. The Moshtaba was the twins. It's Gemini. Orgula lion. Absin, whose father was Sin. That's the maiden Virgo. Zibana, the heavenly fate, is the scales of Libra. Gurtab is the claw, like the Scorpio. There's no history book that tells you the Sumerians knew what the zodiacal animals are. They always attribute it to the Greeks. And then they tell you about other things that they may have picked up from earlier sources. Because even the Greeks admitted that they learned stuff from Phoenicians, and Etruscans learned stuff from Phoenicians as well. So the Sumerians had names and pictures and depictions for all the zodiac ages. One of my good friends and somebody that maybe all of you know and just showed up in the back. Would you like to say something? Okay, if any of you watch Ancient Aliens, then you may be familiar with this gentleman who's Jason Martell. And I appreciate you coming over. Many know him from the Baghdad Battery, but also the new discovery and creation is what, the Egyptian lamplight?
Yeah.
The pyramid lamp? That's one of the best ever, dude.
Whoa, sorry about that.
That's my wireless mic.
You know what, forgive me for interrupting Eric's lecture, but I did call him and ask for his polite permission, and coincidence that I wanted to come and I wanted to tell him anyways something tonight, and found out that he was speaking and thought, my bad, talking into a blank mic. I wanted to converse with Eric about something and found out he was speaking tonight and was bummed that I didn't know he was speaking, so 5 minutes, just wanted to share something. You know, I have always been, as Eric is, an advocate of Sitchin's information. Now, Zachariah Sitchin has now passed away, God rest his soul, and there have been other Sumerologists, such as Kramer, and even way back 100 years ago or further, some German Sumerologists that my current partner has been referencing. And unfortunately, there are current Sumerologists, or people who claim to be Sumerologists, like Mike Heiser and other people who I have nothing against their academic record of the body of evidence that they're looking into. But what I do see are, now that Sitchin is gone, there are less people being able to battle on the home front of saying, no, the idea of a Planet X or a Nibiru based on the information from the Sumerian descriptions, it all comes down to the translations. So I just wanted to take a moment to publicly say that I really want to give Eric a hand of applause in spirit in saying that I'm so glad that he's stepping up, because what I'm seeing on the front lines, and I'm not able to be the front man for the Sitchin battle. For business reasons, I'm doing Ancient Aliens, and that's great, but I can't be on the front line. I'm hoping Eric can be. I'm seeing a lot of people, if you just Google Planet X or Nibiru, it's all people putting out conjecture and really putting down Zachariah's information. So we need people like Eric, along with some good SEO and other things that I need to talk to you about, to at least make sure that the information and the legacy of this research database is upheld to the integrity that it should be. People like Mike Heiser are always saying, I will openly debate anybody who supports Zecharia Sitchin. All right. Well, be careful what you ask for, Mike Heiser, because it might be already on its way. But there are other people out there that, again, there isn't a battle here in the wrong sense of you're right and I'm wrong. It's making a more accurate model of the data and legacy left by Zecharia Sitchin. So I really want to give Eric a huge hand of applause, and ending just saying that we really need more people like Eric who can battle on the field of the translations. That's really all it's going to come down to, you guys. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Sorry to interrupt. Mike's.
Okay, Dennis, are we good now on this? Okay, good. Now that Jason woke us up again, I'm going to blow you guys away with something that should not exist on planet Earth. This tablet, this translation, these numbers should not exist on planet Earth until the 1900s, let's say. Because what you find here, this was translated by Professor H.B. Helprecht. This is in the University of Philadelphia's museum, is a number tablet scale, and I only have one picture of what is multiple pictures of calculations. But let me first bring your attention to the calculation that's at the beginning. What they're doing is calculating a gigantic number, 195 trillion, 955 billion, 200 million, and they're breaking that number down to the lowest common denominator. Can anybody tell me why in the year 4,000 BC anybody's dealing with trillions? Is there some future prophet out there predicting how much the U.S. national debt is going to be? I think it's going to be 195 trillion. It doesn't make sense. It's out of time. It's out of what we've been taught. There is no way that anybody would even care about it. I mean, we're talking about people that are taking carts with wheels in their animals and driving to the fellow village to sell their crops. They're not even driving. And these people are calculating numbers that are astronomical, beyond their era, beyond their knowledge level, and they're breaking it down to the lowest possible number. And that's not the only one they do. They love this number here, 12,960,000. Now, I brought my special calculator for this. Solar powered. It won't survive as long as the tablet over there. 12,960,000 is another one of their starting numbers. When they break that number down, they get the actual number of years of precession right here. Because this number, 12,960 divided by 500 cycles, is how many precessional cycles there are in this number. How the heck could they know that? Who could have calculated the amount of precession times 500 cycles that long ago? It doesn't make sense. Also, when you divide this number down by 20, you're going to get the amount of 3,600. How many orbits of this so-called 10th planet, planet Nibiru, will appear? How many times it'll orbit in that same number cycle? A lot of stuff that was left behind was left to give us a message. And the kings never claimed that they created this by themselves. The kings went to war. They claimed victory. The priests were there. But they said all that we learned from our gods. And these gods were called Anunnaki. Anu from heaven, Na, they came to Ki, earth. Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came. Very similar to the words in Hebrew, which Anakim means giant. Anunnaki is the same consonants. Remember, we're talking about accent changes and spoken word, meaning the spoken word has changed over thousands of years. But if you listen to the consonants and not the vowels, you will hear it. Lord Enki is Anak or Anaki, gigantic. That word Nephilim, that meant fallen ones, from the Aramaic Nephilim, giants, came from the Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came down. These numbers are astronomical in the form of literally, probably space distances. It's the only thing that I could think of that would be comparable, because they're not saying there's not 195 trillion barrels of rye or barley. And there's no way to calculate downward the amount of orbits in a planet that has a giant elliptical orbit. This is one of those dim slides. This is a list of the Anunnaki leaders, the kings, that were ruled on earth before they instituted the human kingship program, which was after the flood. Every one of these leaders ruled for an amount of years of the orbit of this planet. Now we're going to see more evidence of this planet. But the orbital period was 3,600, and everything was based on that sexagesimal system. Once again, 10 times 6 is 60, times 6 is 360, times 10 is 3,600. So that 3,600, which is called a shar, was the base orbital period of where their gods say they came from. Nibiru, Marduk, Planet X, the 10th planet, it has those names. But that's an average orbital period. Any planet that would orbit in that kind of great time frame, it would have a deviation of 1 to 2%, or 3 even, every orbit. So it could be plus or minus 80 years, 100 years, so it may not be exactly on time every time. But also think about it. This being, who was the king for 8 orbits, to humans, it seemed like it was 28,000 years. That's almost virtually immortal. And Dumuzi, who in the Hebrew is called the Tammuz, and is still has a name of one of the Hebrew months after him, but in the form of the Semitic form, he was the king for 10 orbits, 36,000 years. So we had a discussion at dinner about time dilations and how this is possible. NASA did an experiment with atomic clocks. They matched up clocks on Earth, they took one clock up on the space shuttle, and when they brought it back, they were out of sync. The explanation for why the atomic clocks were out of sync was that one moved farther away from the gravitational source, in this case being the core of the Earth. We don't know how time runs if you're not on Earth. We've always been on Earth. For 6 billion people, we've only spent our time here. If time will move slower, if you're farther away from a gravitational source, then this could be normal, that this guy was leader for 8 cycles and he probably retired. It doesn't matter that to us it was 28,000 years. To him, he worked 10 years. So what happens is you have a mismatch. You have these ancient stories and you have the mythology where it seems like these kings, these gods, not the kings, the gods are virtually immortal. But what you're seeing is that it's normal that if you grew up on a planet that had 1 year was 3,600 of our years, that's just 1 year for that being on that planet. There's no way for us to test it right now until we accept that aliens exist, go to their planet, and test time versus how we react to it. Later on, in the older age of the Sumerian culture, there's stories of the grandchildren becoming older than the grandparents. This is something that I talked to Zechariah about personally. Some of the grandchildren did not want to leave because they became too much in love with Earth. And when the older ones left, they left the young ones here to die because they actually became older by being subjected to our fast-spinning planet. And believe me, once every 365 days is really fast. It's like speeding around. This is one of my favorite depictions. What I was trying to say before was the word cylinder seal. Cylinder seal is like this little object here. It's a small little jewel. It's carved into an inverse so that when you roll it, it makes a positive image. It becomes a stamp on a clay. So here, the owner used this picture, and that's what it looks like. This is the only depiction I have found in the ancient world that shows Saturn with rings. Saturn with rings is right here. Here's what's interesting about this picture. They're just sitting around drinking a keg of beer. Keg with a long straw. They didn't know about the pumping thing yet. But the Sumerians had over 220 different recipes for beer, and they let you know what they were so that you could reproduce them. It wasn't like a secret. There was no corporate secrets there. They wanted everyone to drink and have a good time. Up here we have, looks like the moon, Venus, 8-pointed Venus. Here we have the Mars. This must be Jupiter in between, even though it's not depicted gigantic. The thing is, it's in between Mars and Jupiter is the asteroid belt. We know that that's there. That's where the straw is. I'm not sure if they were depicting the straw to make it something as like the asteroid belt, but it definitely is in the same position. And the fact is, if you have rings of Saturn, you have one of the most unusual pieces on Earth. You need, what is it the power you need to see rings of Saturn? At least 10 power, maybe 12 on binoculars. So without 10 power or 12, you can't see the rings. It would be just fuzzy. But most of their depictions don't have any rings at all. This is the only one that I found, that Zechariah found, that has rings. And the age of this one is supposed to be... Actually, I don't have the age of this. 2500 most likely BC, because of the Akkadian language. Okay, now we have one of the most famous pieces in all of Zechariah's body of evidence. Cylinder seal VA243. It's in the East Germany Museum, but it's not East anymore. The ring, the picture depicts a story which is written about where the god Enki, Lord of Earth, gave the plow to mankind. This is Enki. Notice the hat. He's got the horned hat. He's sitting down, and there's the plow. If you notice the hands over here, it's like this. The hands are in the form of giving. So Enki is giving the plow to mankind. Now we know how old this is because the owner is over here. So the age of this is 2300 BC. It's from Acadia, 2500 BC, sorry. How tall, first of all, would Enki be if he stood up? He would definitely be up there. Ancient Aliens has done a little graphic where Enki stands up and he's this tall. This is a human. He does not have the horned hat. This is a god, but he's not one of the top pantheon. So he's an Anunnaki, but he's not of the ruling council. But of course, since the story exists and they're making the picture and the scribe is like, what am I going to put up in that little part between them? What should I put up there? Okay, how about I put up depiction of a solar system? Or wait, which solar system? According to Michael Heiser, I heard from him once, nobody ever drew stars with rays of sun like this. I said, what are you, nuts? I was a kid. I was doing that for 10 years. My daughter draws the sun pictures with rays of the light coming off. Did anybody notice something? Why is the sun in the center? This is 2500 BC. It's 4,500 years ago. Was anybody told that the ancients knew the sun was in the center of the solar system? Based on observations, Hipparchus was laughed out of his Greek assembly. Aha, what are you, crazy? Obviously, everything moves around us. We have to be the center because that's what it looks like from an observational point of view. Yet, somebody knew enough information. Somebody knew enough information to know what precession was, to calculate 195 trillion. Somebody knew enough to know the zodiacal ages, to describe them. There was some advanced knowledge being given out slowly, dwindled, but kept for history to remember. Kept in a museum where it won't disappear, and it's been published many times. And by the way, this is our solar system. Zechariah had a great discussion with E.C. Krupp, the observatory director at the Griffith Park Observatory, which is where I live in Hollywood. And E.C. Krupp has written book after book, and he, by the way, has the original 12th planet on his desk, because he showed a picture of it, and it was on the desk in his library. And he said, no, this is showing not our solar system, but this is showing Jupiter. Jupiter in the teapot. Okay, the teapot is a constellation that the British astronomers created because they used to have tea in the afternoon. Okay, they weren't drinking tea and having teapots in the year 2500 BC, and Jupiter never appeared in the constellation that he said. So then he wrote back to Zach, oh no, I made a mistake, I was too hasty. Maybe they were depicting another solar system. Zach almost fell off his chair and almost lost his typewriter. Because another solar system, you're telling me now that they're depicting a solar system outside of our own? That's even more crazy. Okay? But I can show you how this is our solar system because it's Mercury and Venus, it's Earth and the Moon, it's Uranus and Neptune, this is Pluto, Jupiter and Saturn, Mars, and this little object here is the asteroid belt now. But they depicted it before the formation of the asteroid belt as if they depicted the ancient history of the solar system, the oldest version. Before Earth became Earth, and the pieces of Earth that were from Tiamat, which was a great destroyer, or was destroyed, became the pieces of Earth, our broken up planet that we have today. And Earth is a very interesting planet, with half of it being water, the Pacific Ocean being something like 40 to 45% of the distance of the circumference of the Earth. So it's not just a simple picture anymore to corroborate the textual story of the plow. Now you have a little bit piece of information. Just like this other one was a little bit more than them just drinking by the straw and having a good time of beer because Saturn has rings. There's just a little bit more information being put in so that you know that they know. And here's the names they used for those planets, including little Pluto that is not a planet anymore. Tiamat is like proto-Earth. Mars was called Lamu, Venus was Lahamu, Mercury, Mumu, Neptune was Ea, Uranus, Anu, Pluto was Gaga, Saturn, Anshar, Jupiter, Kishar. Sun is Apsu. All of these beings or character names were part of a story called the Epic of Creation, where the planets became the characters, and the characters did things. Like there was an invader of Tiamat that came in, and Kishore got hit, or Anu was damaged. And so they made it like a play, like you would with kids, to teach the early formation of the solar system. Well, first, this is the first time a history of the solar system has even been written down. Second, they're writing one down that fits the story we know of. Third, they actually describe every single planet we know of, which in our culture, Uranus, Neptune were not discovered to the late 1800s, and Pluto in the 1930s. And yet here they have them, plus all the other advanced knowledge. There is a body of evidence that keeps growing that corroborates not only the stories, but the physical and the visual picture. This is one of my favorite pieces on Earth. I think it's one of the most important pieces on Earth. It's in the British Museum, permanent display. The guard who stands guard next to it doesn't really know what he's looking at. This is, well, we think it's clay, but it's really melted in a weird way because, see, this is smooth. I'm going to show you what it looks like in this form where you can see the little diagrams easier. The first thing over here, we have an ellipse. If any of you remember, if you're in astronomical history, Johann Kepler was the first astronomer to discover that the true path of orbits was not a perfect circle, but an ellipse, a double foci type of pattern and orbit. Up here, Zechariah is going to translate this. We're going to see that in his translation. I like to comment on this section here, and as it relates to this, plus this. If you travel in a three-dimensional space, you don't just need a set of 3 coordinates. You actually need 7. You need to connect 2 dots and a line, another set of 2 dots and a line, and a third set of coordinates so that you have 3 intersecting lines. Why do you need 3 intersecting lines? Because that's where you are, or that's where you're going. You see, you could be here going to where those 3 intercept, or you could be at the 3 interceptions going to where you want to go. So this piece on Earth actually shows a map of people coming to planet Earth. And when they came to planet Earth, they passed by planets on the way from the outside of the solar system in, and here's the ones they passed: Pluto, Uranus, Neptune, Jupiter, Saturn, Mars, and Earth. Earth became the 7th planet. Not the 3rd rock from the sun, which they depict here. The sun, Mercury, Venus, Earth. They show that here. But the deity Enlil, the god Enlil, when he first approached Earth from a mountainous planet, made a course correction between Dilgon and Apin, which we think is between Mars and Jupiter, where the asteroid belt is. And I found different uses of Dilgon and Apin, meaning Mars and Jupiter, in other astronomical texts. So what's happening is we're looking at this piece of the pie here. This took Zechariah 1 month to translate because this is Sumerian words, but written with Akkadian cuneiform. Now here we have another one of these situations right here, where we're going to see how this word changes to something in Hebrew. For example, Kakab Anu. Kakab Anu means the astronomical object of Anu. But in Hebrew, Kochav is star. The Sumerians used Kakab as any astronomical object. Some professors argue that Kakab Nibiru was a constellation Nibiru. Some say Kakab Nibiru was the giant planet Jupiter. Zechariah was the first one who said, no, Nibiru was its own planet. It had nothing to do with existing known planets. It was completely unique. Okay. Also, there was a NASA scientist who was researching Zechariah's work, and he was working actually on something that we're going to see. But once he realized that Zach called Earth the 7th planet, and that's what the Sumerians said, he was convinced. Because only from the outside coming in would you call Earth the 7th. And for many years, the 7 Sisters was mistranslated, and people thought it was the Pleiades. 7 dots on cylinder seals and 7 dots on depictions has been misidentified also, and not be termed Earth. We may have one that shows that that's Earth. So this shows, again, all the planets in our solar system, just like the cylinder seal V8243, just like the little cylinder seal that shows Saturn with rings. It's corroborating evidence in a visual form that corroborates the story that was written down. And so you have corroboration on all levels. And since it's a worldwide occupation, we also have a different country that has a very interesting depiction. I'll let you guys kind of look at that for a second. I'll point out that there's something above ground and something below ground. This is from Zechariah's book. Well, he had it in all of them, the 12th planet. I went to see the original. I went to see the original in the University of Pennsylvania, Philadelphia's research library, the library where all the professors put their publications out. I've seen the original from 1908 to 1910. It looks just like this. Zechariah did not add anything to this. I've also seen the original picture of what it looks like now on the actual wall. And of course, it's dimmed and the colors are not strong. But let me show you what you're looking at here. Now, what I'm reporting to you, I'm going to show you what I observe. I'm not going to tell you what I think it is. What I observe is something above ground and something below ground. I observe that this above ground chamber, this conical object, looks like what Naram Sin had in his picture that all those people were revering or at least looking at. A conical object. I observe that these people are facing away from the object and they're not looking at it because it's too holy. They're avoiding face contact with this object that happens to have a rounded shield that has straps on it, but yet this is not a pristine, perfect object of the gods. This is a used device that's scratched and had at least been used once, and not like NASA stuff falling off. Apparently it stayed intact. Below ground, we have two guys here, and there's hoses there, and believe it or not, they're doing maintenance. This is from a tomb called the Tomb of Hoy in Egypt, and Hoy was a governor of the area that he was in. And this was depicting basically his lifestyle. So this is maintenance being done as if preparing a technological device for the next use. Cleaning it, making sure it's working, there's no holes, there's no seals broken. And this is the way an underground missile silo would disperse exhaust and engine fire to get it away from the body of the object, which is a missile or a rocket. And this is all working gears and working things. So what do you think it is? How many stages? I think it's double stage because it looks like this would be a landing shield, scratched and used, heated up, but still effective. You see, the thing is, if this was the only one like this, again, it's a unique piece, but the problem is, when you have a worldwide civilization and worldwide record keeping, you will find stuff in other places. So now you saw a picture. This is what we describe as a rocket launch, okay? The space shuttle, fire, smoke, loud. It's the loudest man-made sounds on Earth, they say. People who have witnessed it love it. Shakes the ground. So I would expect that if there was really rockets, if that's true in the ancient world, I would expect to see a textual description of a rocket launch or landing. This is one we're familiar with. This is one that's just static, so there's no words to describe it. And now we have a line from Gilgamesh, the oldest literary tale. Column 9. Gilgamesh was 16 tablets long. All 16 have been found in at least 3 different languages. Okay? Gilgamesh is talking to his friend Enkidu. Gilgamesh was woken up. Why am I awake? Did you pass by me? My limbs are paralyzed. He can't even move. The heavens cried out and earth roared. Daylight vanished and darkness issued forth. Lightning flashed. Fire broke out. Clouds swelled. It rained death. The glow disappeared. The fire went out, and all that had fallen turned to ashes. So I was thinking about, wow, that sounds a lot like this, but is it in the right order? I mean, could it have been translated so correctly? First, he describes the sound and the earth crying out. Becomes dark. Lightning flashed, the fire broke out as it's moving out of his vicinity. Then the clouds and it's raining death, and who knows, what's inside the exhaust, if it's safe or not. The glow disappeared, the fire went out, and all turned to ashes. Actually, it is in the correct order. The correct order, if you witness a rocket launch and described it, would be in the same order that Gilgamesh wrote it down, or whoever the scribe was that recorded it. It's not out of order. It fits the order of events. It's a story that's written that matches a picture that's found, that matches another piece that shows that there's advanced knowledge, advanced beings, and advanced technology being used on Earth, but in the oldest part of our history, before the modern age, the oldest age. So it was able to influence what came later. That's what's so special about this. Gilgamesh is where you find the story of the flood. Gilgamesh is where you find the story of him losing his everlasting life because the plant that he was supposed to get was taken away by a snake. Yeah. In Gilgamesh, you get resurrection, Savior, living forever. I mean, you get so many of the themes that we know about. So then led me to another thought. Okay, come on. I must be crazy. Everybody must be crazy. There's no way there's rockets in the olden days. How are you going to launch rockets? We build these trusses. NASA rolls it out at 2 miles an hour. By the way, in September, we're going to have the space shuttle land at LAX, and it's going to roll to the California Science Center. Everybody stay away from the freeways because the space shuttle is going to move at 2 miles an hour. I'm serious. Maybe 1. Okay, don't answer this. Does anybody think that this is a big rock? A big stone? Come on, I think I better 1 minute. Is it a big rock? Okay, thank you. I felt pretty small next to it. I was sitting next to this is on Malta. This is from the temple, I think it's called Gigantea. And I'm thinking, what the heck is a person doing, our size, humans, building with stones that are this big? Why can't they just use these little ones? Or these? They're so easy. Why do they have to build these big ones? What's the deal? Why are you going to make your life so hard? That's not a small stone. This is the biggest cut stone in the world, Baalbek, Lebanon. And you're going to see in the picture, hopefully, I did not forget to put that slide in, of how this is in place 1.5 miles away, not at the bottom. No. This doesn't form the bottom because it's too big for the bottom. In the bottom, they have little ones. This has to go 3 levels higher because for some reason they had no problem moving 1,100-ton stones and cutting them out of the quarry. This is everybody from the group with Zechariah, 30 people in front of 1 cut brick. That's a brick, like kids play with bricks. Imagine you had these bricks at home. You wouldn't want your kids to play with those. In place, they are up here. 1 level is these 3 sets of smaller stones. This is medium size, and this is the trilliton. Okay. Why? How old? First of all, the people of the area have always had the history of this being there. There was never a time when they didn't have it. So as far as their storytelling goes, it's been there, always the gods built it. What's the point? It's on the biggest stone platform in the world. Baalbek, Lebanon is a place where the Romans, during their empire, had a temple to Jupiter in the same location because the Romans used to adopt ancient sites. But why would you need a giant stone platform of 1,100-ton stones that we cannot even move today? We can lift them up or down, but we couldn't move them, and then there'd be no point for it. I think it was because of the rocket exhaust to protect the population. Because people gathered around the gods. You were launching, you were landing. They may have been landing with retro rockets, we don't know. They did not have a space shuttle where it flew and landed like a plane. So you could be killing your population, who want to revere you and bring you food and other things in the temple. By the way, I don't know if you see the person right here, Wally. One of our good friends got up there to show the difference in scale. And once again, a depiction shows up again. This is a coin called the Byblos coin. We actually think that this is, here we go again, another conical object depicted, independent of these others, but this we think is the Baalbek platform shown in like a 2-dimensional funny form. So you see, even though this is going up, this shows the walls flat around it. So the Byblos coin shows what we think was on the Baalbek platform, of course, before it took off and left. All around the world. Now you're seeing something that's very special here. The first time that language was written down, it was written down in picture forms. The first time those picture forms were translated, they were mistranslated. So the word that you see here is dingir. That means the word God. You are looking at the first time the word God was used, incorrectly by the way, and mistranslated. So when I go back and I see the oldest Sumerian pictographic writing, and then it translates, and you see what it says the God Enlil, the God Inanna, and this is the picture it shows before. For some reason, the God picture was mixed up with a 2-stage rocket ship picture. That doesn't seem to make sense, unless the ancients were just depicting what they saw. and recording it like we record our history, and they weren't creating fantasy or science fiction. Din is from the Semitic word justice or holy. Mujahideen means holy warrior. Beit Din in Hebrew is house of judgment. Gir is flashy, fiery, or lightning. And you know what? That was Zechariah's translation that, guess what? Became part of the official translated Sumerian language now that they publish when they publish the Dictionary of Sumerian Terms. Gir means to flash like lightning. When I showed this to Zechariah, there was another one of those moments where he almost fell off his chair. I said, you won't believe this, Zach. I'm in an official Sumerian dictionary from a college that I bought, and Gir, it says flashy lightning. He's like, what are you talking about? There's no way. And I faxed it to him, and he couldn't believe it. This author and her knowledge of Sumerian picked it up and realized that, yes, when they were describing these holy, righteous people of the flashy, fiery object thing, they meant the word astronaut. They meant the word space traveler, heaven traveler, something similar, lofty ones. People didn't just fly with wings. They traveled in vehicles, in vessels. And that's what the first time the word God and the picture form was misused.
Eric, it might be a good time to take a break now.
Okay. Okay, this is probably a good time to take a break. Yes, perfect time. Okay, we'll take a break.
Okay, we're going to take a 15-minute break and then be back here for the finishing of the program. I'll be around with raffle tickets.
Let's see what slide am I? Where am I? I'm here.
Okay. So how much time you got?
36 to 56 is 20 slides. This leads into the whole progression of how these terms and words change through history and from one culture to the next, based on language and based on usage. And what you'll see here is that it becomes a play on words, it becomes mistranslated, it becomes concept ideas that get a little bit, twisted slightly. In Sumerian, Din Gir meant the righteous one of the Gir, righteous ones of the sky chambers, what we would call astronauts. Mistranslated right away by the Assyrians and Babylonians to the words Ilu, Ilani, or Aluti. So when you see a Assyrian or Babylonian text, what you see is the word in Sumerian, Din Gir, and then you see the name of the god. Well, it changed from Din Gir to Ilu, Ilani, or Aluti, and then the name of the god. So when the texts were copied, and back in the olden days, when one culture or empire conquered another one, they didn't erase their memory. They copied the books. It was like their form of taking over the culture. The Romans did a similar thing, but they used to distort the religions. These old Sumerian gods were related, so when they conquered each other's territory or they had family squabbles, they considered it family squabbles, and we were kind of like pawns in that game. So Din Gir is one term that becomes Ilu, Ilani, and later on in Hebrew, it becomes the word El, Eloha, and Elohim. Now there's been a big controversy whether the word Elohim is a plural or a singular word. I've argued with professors on this as well. There's already two forms of the singular word God in the word Elohim. In Hebrew, Im, like the Semitic, makes it plural, but you have El already, and then you have Eloha. Both means God, singular. And then you have Elohim. Later on, we have characters that are called B'nai HaElohim, again in plural in Hebrews, children of the gods, referring to beings that were hybrids, children of gods, or the Anunnaki, and the daughters of men, human females. These are some of the demigods and ancient people in the ancient texts in the Bible that lived 700 and 800 years old, Methuselah being the oldest one. There's other terms in Sumerian for the gods who came down from above, Anunnaki, and then there's this term Igigi. The Anunnaki were the ruling class. They were the command officers. The Igigi were the rank and file subscripts or, whatever. They didn't have rank yet. Igigi actually means those who observed and see. Again, another switch into Hebrew. The word for eye and to see in Hebrew is ear or iri. Igi became iri. The G became an R sound. So Igi is to see. In Hebrew, iri is to see. In Sumerian, Anunnaki means those who from heaven and earth came down. In Hebrew, Anak, Anakim, or Anaki is the word giant. The word Enki is the same as saying Anaki. Forget about the vowels. Think of just the A-na-ka sound being spoken for thousands of years. Some people say tomato, some people say tomato. Some people say Anki, some people say Enki. It's still the same Hebrew word meaning giant. Anunnaki is the direct predecessor to the Hebrew word for the word giant. Okay? The word Nephilim is the same thing as the Anunnaki in the meaning of the sound. So, Anunnaki turns into Hebrew in Anakim or Anaki, the sound of the word, but the meaning becomes Nephilim. Those from heaven to earth came down, those who have fallen down. Nephilim is the root of the Christian term for fallen angels. The fallen angels were just the Igigi who came down because they were in ships orbiting and were tired of being cooped up. They said, let us spread out on this beautiful planet. Oh, and by behind, there's a nice girl over there. Hey. So this became a problem. And I'll explain to you later why that's a problem. Because many of the gods, not only of the biblical God, did not like the fact that there was this intermarriage going on. Okay, and it's part of the reason for the destruction of the floods. Because the B'nai HaElohim, the children of the gods, the descendants of the Igigi, which were Anunnaki, but they were just not ranked, they were still extraterrestrial, they were not humans, were getting involved with human females. Their modern term in Hebrew for ghost is Rephaim. And Rephaim is also a term that they use to describe that character Og, king of Bashan, that King David fought. And he fought in a slingshot, and there's a famous story how he fought. Well, guess what? Og was called a Goliath. Goliath. Anybody heard the word Goliath? You're speaking Sumerian again. Goliath is the word Goliath. It means great man. The term that we still use today, Goliath, which still means a great man or a great stature, is a Sumerian word Goliath. And by the way, I forgot to mention that when you say like Eden, like Garden of Eden, E is house in Sumerian, and Din is judgment. So the Garden of Eden is like where the gods lived. It was a precinct called the House of the Holy One. In Hebrew, the word Eden became Beit Din, house of judgment or justice. So when you say Eden and you mean Garden of Eden, that's a Sumerian word that's still existing today, just like Lulu, just like Goliath, and just like a whole bunch of other terms, they still exist in usage today. Why did these characters come down and why were it created and what happened? Okay, this is from the Bible Land Museum, seal 377 in Jerusalem. This was found in Israel. And this is a cylinder seal rolled where these characters that are Anunnaki have their hands thrown up. But this is not them depicting building the Tower of Babel. This is them depicting the story of how the rank and file Igigi protested. They went on strike. They said, we're not going to be working anymore. We're not working in the mines. We didn't come here to get dirty and get sweaty and work. We were supposed to be space crew, orbital crew. We were supposed to have rank and file and become officers. They thought there was a career path. They were told to do the grunt work. So literally there was an argument in the council of what are we going to do? These guys were protesting around Enlil's house, causing him to be up at night, making noises. The work wasn't being done. When I was in Israel, I talked to Joan Westenholz, who was one of the directors, that was arguing with the museums, the writers of their books, to retranslate what the meaning of this seal is. Notice it says God's building a tower. Well, look how small the tower is. It's not much of a tower. So it actually depicts, and she was one of the proponents of the story of them going on strike. So why were humans created in the first place? Because the Igigi went on strike and didn't want to do the work. So they had a council meeting. And they came to a declaration. Hopefully it's clear. Right? There. Okay. The top of it. This is from Atrahasis. Again, this version is an Akkadian version. Atrahasis. And let men bear the load of the gods. They called up the goddess and asked her. Here she's called Mami. You know what that is? Mommy. Without the A being distorted. Mommy is another Sumerian invention, the word itself. Create a mortal that he may bear the yoke. Let him bear the yoke, the work of Enlil. Let him bear the work of the gods. Nintu, who's also called Ninti, is Lady of Life, which also means Lady of the Rib, because there's a also another stretch in the Hebrew word where when it said that Eve was created from the rib of Adam, well, that's a play on Ninti's name, being the lady of the rib, the lady of life. And these things keep crisscrossing. And then we get down to here to the story. Now remember, this is not the biblical story, but what we're having here is the story of Ninti is going to mix clay with flesh and blood, and a God and a man will be mixed together in clay. Let hear the drum beat forever after. Let a ghost come into existence from the God's flesh. Well, that's an interesting term. That's the same term in the Bible where it says, let the breath of life was breathed into man by God. And then we have a little bit more, another double line. The ghost, to not forget the slain God, who was Dumuzi. The great Anunnaki who signs the fates. Ninti mixed clay with flesh and blood. Now, how are we created in the Bible? Well, in the Bible, we were created in, let's make man in our image and our likeness. Again, it's in a plural setting. There's somebody speaking to a group, like a council. Okay? This is not clear here. Over here, it says here, come on, right? Okay. And the trees of the field were not yet on the earth, and the herb of the field is not yet sprouted, and God sent rain upon the earth, and there was no work in soil. It says here, God formed man out of dust from the ground. We just had the word dust here. Clay, dust, flesh, and blood is the same term in Hebrew. I'll show you in a second. But here's the most important line. And he blew into the nostrils the soul of life, and he became a living being. That's the same line as saying, let a ghost come into existence from God's flesh. It's the same concept. The life was breathed in from one being to another. Now here's the play on the words of flesh, blood, man. The word for blood is dam in Hebrew. Okay? Blood is dam. Man is Adam or Adam. Red is Adom. Soil or earth is Adamah. The way Hebrew works in Semitic languages is there's a root word, and you add stuff in the front, you add stuff in the back, you add the sounds, and you add vowels, and you have Adamah, Adom, Dam, and Adom. 4 words that are the same root that have the same meaning as clay, blood, red, earth. It's all the same root story. It's the same concept. It's just been edited down for the Bible version. Okay? The Bible version is borrowing the Sumerian version. That's what people don't get. There's a big argument in some states whether they should teach creationism or teach evolution. But they aren't going to teach the creationism where the Bible borrowed the story from, the bibliography of the Bible. They're going to take the edited last version. Well, that's not the complete story. The funny thing is the Bible leaves out some of the best parts of the story. Hopefully we'll see some of those. Okay, and here's another version of a visual image depicting the story that we just saw. We just read about Ninti creating life and mixing clay and blood, and here's a test tube. And here's flasks on the wall of the different mixtures. That didn't come true, that did happen. There was a lot of mistakes discussed in the text where some men and women were half animal, like the characters like a minotaur. You have some beings that drank from the river. They could not sit at a table. There was a lot of other weird stories about the failures before they had the successful Adam. The Adamu, was the first model man. That's what's being depicted here. This is the 9 leaves of the 9 birth months. Again, this is Mother Earth, Ninharsag, or Ninti, holding up the first human that they created, and the test tube is here. Now, if you were to draw it in a modern way now, it wouldn't even be that much different. You may add a little computer printout or something, but this is the Bible story because there's clay being mixed, and it's borrowing the same terms and using them. And now here's the prelude to the flood. And it came to pass when man began to increase on the ground, and daughters were born to them, the sons of the rulers. That's not what it says in Hebrew. It says children of the gods, B'nai Elohim. But this version of the Bible in English intentionally mistranslated the Hebrew, so you can't say of gods. That's what's funny about this version. They saw that the sons of the rulers saw that the daughters of man were good, and they took themselves from whoever they chose. In this term, when there's God, they use the word Hashem, which means the name. Here it says the Nephilim were in the earth in those days. Okay, here's that what used to be translated as giants for many, many years, especially in Christian Bibles. That's the one that Zechariah complained about. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of the rulers, once again it says in the Hebrew, B'nai Elohim, the children of the gods, would consort with the daughters of man, whoever they choose. They were the mighty men from old, men of Olam. Now the word Olam is translated devastation. It doesn't mean that. Olam, Zechariah believed, was another word for Nibiru, but Olam could also be an everlasting type of term. But the only usage ever where it was devastation was in here when they were trying to cover up the meaning. There's a lot of intentional changing of words and translating for the Bible to prove that it's a book about a single God, that's a deity, that's the leader of all, when its source material was based on books that had multiple God characters. How do you do that? How do you take the creator God, the mother goddess, the god of wars and birth and all those things, and you put them into one compound character? It's not that easy. But that's what the Bible did, especially in the first few chapters of Genesis, in the borrowed material. Here's from Gilgamesh. Again, now this is after the flood. Now here's what let me go back for a second to point this out. The reason that the flood was given was that the wickedness of the humans was great, but it's preceded by talking about how they were consorting, the sons of the gods were consorting with the human females. So the reason for the flood was this hybrid creating of these people, I suppose. Over here is what's happening during the flood, okay? In the flood story in the Sumerian version, this is from Gilgamesh, the dove is released after 7 days and comes back without a branch. Eventually, the raven is the one who does not come back, a blackbird. Later on, the Bible changed it to the dove not coming back with the branch and changed the colors of the birds. But what's important here is this. God smelt the offering. That was the offering of after they got off the ark and they cooked food. And they smelt the pleasing fragrance. Okay? Also, I don't have it in this slide, but Ninti, the goddess, was weeping and crying for the children that were dying on earth because they were watching what was happening. This part is left out of the Bible. Just have God giving the command, then comes the destruction, and Noah comes out, and then Noah builds us. Guess what God says after Noah's sacrifice? God smelled the pleasing aroma. Something's not quite right here. The biblical God is not supposed to enjoy the smell of meat being cooked, or flesh, or food. He's supposed to be a non-physical creator God of the whole universe, a creator God of such immense nature that he should be beyond food being cooked and the smell. But you know what? The line was too good. The scribe couldn't leave it out. He just loved it. The God smelled the fragrance. The God smelled the pleasing aroma. We keep that in. What do you mean? How can you keep that in? Well, just leave it in. Okay, leave it in. God smelled the pleasing aroma. Now your copying came from. Now the copied material has a direct source because the line is exactly the same. Some stuff, of course, they kept out. The stories of the female god fearing getting involved were turned into the male god for the biblical story. But some stuff they just couldn't get rid of. They had to keep it there. And thanks to that effort, we now see the chain of evidence, the progression of one story from one culture going to another story, another culture. And there's a whole other issue about not killing people and wanting to kill, but it happens to be that when you shed up another person, you're shedding part of the blood of God and the soul, and it's a very metaphysical point. Okay, it's for a much deeper discussion. Okay, now this tells the story of a little more what was happening when the flood was going on. Up here, Ninti is crying. They're washed up. The people are like rafts. They are like on the open country. I've seen them and wept over them. Shall I ever fish for them? The gods wept with her. They were filled with grief. They longed for beer. Again, the beer. Where she sat weeping, but they still wanted to drink. They were thirsty. I mean, it goes out of their way to say how thirsty they were. Apparently, they left without much provisions on their ships. For 7 days and 7 nights, the storm, the torrent flood came. It's a lot longer in the Bible version. The flood's a year long. In the Sumerian version, it's 7. And 7 is common, like the 7 days of creation, and it's in the week. But again, we still have the line from after Hashas, that smelt the fragrance, gathered like flies out over the offering. And when they had eaten the offering, they also promised not to destroy people again. But all because of this, Enlil P was pleased that he was glad that some humans survived and not everybody was killed. Because Enlil was the god that didn't mind if humans were wiped out. He loved humans. But you see, again, we have another version of, first of all, more of the story going on than we were told, plus lines being copied that they just loved. They were just too good to. And that's what Ninti looked like when she was looking out over the flood. She was looking out of the window of an object and weeping for us, well, for our sisters. And this kind of picture appears many times. It's not a single example. One slide I have of an archaeologist digging it out of the ground, of literally picking up one of these top pieces. These were on the tops of monuments and even pyramids. They're not sure exactly. And this is Inanna, also known as Ishtar. She's one of the goddesses. She was the first bikini model in history. She's unique in that she got around the world. She has depictions of her, what looks like flight gear. What I'm going to discuss here is the miracles that she did, that we call miracles, that later on borrowed and attributed to somebody else. Because when Inanna got upset, she really got upset. Because in one case, all the wells of the land she filled with blood. All the groves and gardens of the land she filled with blood. The male slaves came to gather firewood. They could drink nothing but blood. The female slaves to fill up with water filled with nothing but blood. Does that sound familiar to anybody? Water's turning to blood, rivers turning to blood. It was done by Moses. It was one of the miracles of the plagues of Egypt. They underlined there, they shall change to blood. And then later on, the river changed to blood. The fish life that was in the river died. The river became of Egypt. Nobody could drink from the river, and the blood was throughout the land of Egypt. So apparently rivers and waters turning to blood is a very common occurrence in the old days. Either not a miracle, or somebody was borrowing a story that they really, that Inanna did thousands of years before Moses did, or before Moses' story was written down. Against another biblical parallel. Just the birth story of Moses, the greatest prophet of the Old Testament, who was, as we know, born in secret, put into a basket, and left to float on the river, just like the king of Sargon. Sargon was conceived in secret, put into a basket, covered with pitch, let to float, and found by a noble person that raised him up to be the king of his population, of his society. In Moses' case, he became a prince, and then later on, when he discovered his heritage, either left or and then came to free the slaves. Both stories are the same. Both birth stories are thousands apart. Somebody is borrowing from an earlier source. A later source can't be borrowing from an earlier source. It has to always be the later source they're borrowed from. So Inanna's story, Song the Great's stories were borrowed, which leads to the question of how much biblical stories, true original stories for the Bible itself, or how many were borrowed to teach the point, to give the story, or just to maintain a story that everyone knew for thousands of years. There's no malicious involved. They just knew these stories, they loved them, and they told them, retold them every time the society and the culture changed. The problem is if a person is too tied up to the stories in the Bible instead of the message. When you're tied to the story happened, resurrection, 3 days, it had to be this, then the spilled blood, this and that, and you're tied to the details, miss the whole point. Because they're all borrowed. Half of Revelation's borrowed from the book of Noah. You're going to see some scrolls here in a second. This is a ram with its horns caught in a thicket. That's how it's described. In the story of Abraham, in the Bible, before he sacrifices Isaac, he's about to kill him because he's hearing voices in his head that says, go take your son and sacrifice him. And then the angel stops him at the last minute, and they sacrifice a ram. This ram was found in the royal tomb of Ur, which is where Abraham came from. So somehow the story is connected, and there was the physical evidence of the archaeological find there, which matches a piece in the story. Again, it's another connection. This sits in the University of Philadelphia's museum on permanent display. Along with other things found in the royal Ur is that the Sitchin Foundation is researching the bone. I've even found the name was Queen Poabi, whose bones are in the British Museum. And they're tested for the DNA because her remains were very large, and so was her husband. She was not your average size human. The cranium was way big, the size of her structure was way too big, and we're waiting to see what happens. That hasn't been started yet, but it's a project in process. Okay. Now, this is from the Book of Giants, and it's from the Dead Sea. And once again, it's out of time. It doesn't make sense. Because Gilgamesh is mentioned who's involved, and they're having a conversation about what to do about it. But the Dead Sea Scrolls are supposed to be right after the time of Jesus and for the next couple of hundred years after that, time of the Essenes. But here they're quoting Gilgamesh in real time, speaking and getting involved and deciding what to do, and the giants rejoicing over them, and then there's Nephilim mentioned separately from giants. Well, that ties a whole era of thousands of years together that shouldn't be tied together. So it becomes a timeline now. Because you should not have these characters mentioned in this time frame. Well, of course, unless the Dead Sea Scrolls are completely different from what the official archaeologists think they are. It doesn't make sense. It's out of time. And I also wonder if the original Hebrew on here for Nephilim, what does it say here for giants? Does it say Anakim? I assume it says Anakim, otherwise it would say Nephilim. But this is what they put in the English version. Unfortunately, this book doesn't have the Hebrew version in it. It just has the English. And the first version of this book that I got did not have the Book of Giants in it. I had to get the revised version a few years later to finally have them put this in. It was left out on purpose because of the agenda of the people that are releasing it. Okay, here you have Hammurabi being instructed by Shamash. Now, Shamash is the name of a god, but in Hebrew, the word for sun is Shemesh. So even though it's the name of a god, it's also a Hebrew term for an astronomical object, the sun. What he's doing is teaching Hammurabi the law code that Moses later on writes down that has similar statements. And what you get is an example of the king saying, I did not create this law code. I'm not taking credit for it. I'm telling you that I'm recording it as the God gave it to me. And here's what I told my scribe to do and my artist. I told him to depict me thinking, and depict my God sitting, and depict us having a conversation and a discussion and working out the details of what it means. Don't depict me being a genius and creating something new that hasn't existed before in the history of the world, because that's not what happened. He ordered them to create a picture of what history was. Human and alien interacting to create rules for humans on how we should behave, rules of crime and punishment, and rules of behavior. Here's one last shot of Zechariah showing we are in Mexico at Tula. This is called Atlantis of Tula. Okay? What he's showing us here is that this little guy has a torch that looks like a blowtorch. He can either melt rock or melt metal, but it's a tool. And we looked around at all of these things, and we found them using tools left and right. I mean, they just depicted them having tools in their hands and using them. For torch, for mining, for anything. If you come to another planet, you take to you, and then you use what is for that planet, like stone. Stone was created from the heat of the earth when it was formed. Therefore, stone is a good insulator against a rocket ship's fuel and exhaust, because it's created from heat. Lava, obviously, that's soft, came out of the earth, and then when it's dry, until you heat it up, it'll be solid. Same kind of example. If you come to earth, you don't bring with you big, gigantic, trusses and rods. You take tools and you build from what you find. That's what we find around. We find the evidence left behind of what was created and built, but we don't find the tools except for the depictions of the tools. This is the hardcover versions of some of the older books that make the Earth Chronicles series. There's a lot more books since this slide. But this is where they started. The 12th Planet was the first book, and it goes in order like this. After this, there's another 10 books, or 8. The Lost Book of Enki is a book that Zach compiled from fragments of over 800 different fragments from different cultures. So one of them could be Hittite, talking about a story. Then one of them could be from Turkey, where the story continues, but the name changes. Zach had an overall theory that the origins of religions all came from these stories that we've been talking about. So he say, doesn't that make us all brothers and sisters? Why are people arguing over the prophet who came, or the prophet of a specific country and their way of teaching, when the origin was united at some point? He believed in the unification of earth and the people of earth, not the separation of us, not believing in something's different to you when you die because you believe in something different, and therefore if the person doesn't believe what you believe, something different happens to you. He believed that we should be unified under the common or originating source of the material that we all have been subjected to the last version of, the last edited version of, the short version. Because even with everything I've shown you here, which was 50 slides and a couple, I have 256 slides in total. I can do a whole weekend that just keeps going and going and going, and it doesn't stop. But these are the basic books in what's called the Earth Chronicles series. Zach finished up the Earth Chronicles with 2 books, of which I'm in one of them. It's in the back where the t-shirts are, pictures of me traveling with some of the groups. And he talked about some of the places that we went together as a group, because his concept was to show people on trips what he wrote about and show them what he found and where they were. And I'll tell you something, we went to the museums where timelines were changed. In the Olmec Museum in Mexico, there was an original 3100 BC starting point for the Olmec civilization, which matched Zechariah's theory. Later on, they moved it to 2000 BC. They changed it 1,000 years because they didn't want to credit where it came from. That Zechariah figured that from Africa came over to Central America and was the source of a lot of their culture. But to countries like Egypt or Mexico, they want to retain the history themselves. They don't want to give it away to alien beings or other cultures or anything else. So they're very reluctant to release information that would support it. And that's why you have to kind of go all over the world to find it. In some cases, inside of the desk of a museum director was a little rocket ship that Zechariah wrote about. I don't have it in this thing. But literally a physical rocket ship you can hold in your hand and look at one like a shuttlecraft. The director had it in his shelf, in his drawer. Zechariah says, why? He says, because there's nothing else on earth. It's the only one like it. How can I put on display a unique piece? How could he, the director of a museum, which was found in a piece 12 feet down, how could he possibly put down something that's unique? So Zechariah sent pictures into him of the different objects that looked just like that object. And eventually it went out onto the museum as, well, we're not sure if it's real or not. The evidence is literally sitting there, but either people are scared of funding or they're scared to make a ripple or a wave. I'm not exactly sure why. I would think that if Egypt came out and said we have some evidence, they would get more tourist business. Not, but Egypt is another story in itself. This was my certificate from Zechariah, which was achieved after so many full weekend seminars that I helped run with him all over the country. We were at least in 8 cities, and we knew the attendance would be good. We used to do the weekend in Zechariah with the presenting, questions and answers, and we would have full weekends together. It was an incredible time. Forever will it change my life. I miss Zechariah a lot. His death affected me a lot more than I first thought in the beginning. And like Jason said, there isn't that many people that left who have the basis not only in the Hebrew, the Semitic languages to connect the dots and to understand how they influence us today and how we're still using them today. So hopefully this is just the first of a new series of lectures, part 1 of Zechariah's Best Evidence. And now take questions and answers. However, yeah. Thank you. Do you guys have a certain system how you have people go up to a mic and ask, or how do you do it? Okay.
Was Zechariah saying that humans were hybrids between the Anunnaki and Homo sapiens?
Yes. There was the original beings that they mixed their blood were, let's say, caveman, for example. Okay, Neanderthal, any other purpose, any good word. But the final version that survived, all of us have some part of them still in us. So yes.
Was that about 400,000 years ago when they first came out?
About 403,000 years ago, they first came down and started to occupy Earth. And then about 200,000 years after, or from now back, they start to experiment to create humans because of the strike of the Igigi who did not want to do the work. So there was a long trial and error period before they found the model man. there was a lot of mistakes, and they depict the mistakes, and they're funny. I mean, they had stories where people couldn't hold in their urine and their poop, and they had no manner. They just screamed and made noise. I mean, it wasn't easy going.
Is that planet still coming through?
Every 3,600 years, Nibiru orbits our sun in Mars and Jupiter. It doesn't always cause a problem, but anything that comes around every 3,600 years, and if you count the age of our solar system as 4 billion or 5, well, it's been around a million times, a million. So sometimes it comes around, it can cause gravitational problems, slippage of ice, it could cause disasters, it could cause nothing. It just depends on the situation.
Do we know when it's coming through?
Zechariah said, calculated that 2085 or 86, he thought was the next closest path, and that was based on an observation from the last king of Babylon, whose name escapes me right now, who saw the planet of millions of years in a constellation. So he identified the age at the time. Over there? Yes.
So he's read, Zach has read several different versions of the Bible, right? I guess my question is, how has he figured out which one is like the most accurate?
Well, the problem with the Bible is that every version we read is English. And I showed you some of the English there, that was from the Bible that I used for the lecture, which intentionally mistranslates. I mean, if I had a 2-hour time frame, I would have showed you the Hebrew also and showed you how the Hebrew was directly mistranslated. I mean, intentionally mistranslated. So that the meaning comes out differently, so you don't have word children of the gods. So they have some of the rules. No other place do they do that. But in these specific situations where the Bible is borrowing an older story, and you can identify that older story by looking at those lines that are similar, those are the times where those mistranslations occur. So there's still King James versions that says giants, but now there's been a big move. If I look a lot at the bookstore, and I see now it says Nephilim a lot, and giants. They've taken away the giant word. And I can't think of any other author other than Zechariah who's brought it a big deal. So which version is right? One that's not in English. Yes, okay, Bob.
Is there any evidence that suggests that there's more than one God source from different places?
Well, yes. The evidence, though, it's like roundabout. In other words, the Anunnaki believed the creator of all. They didn't think they were the creator of all. Humans thought they were the creators of all. They saw them doing advanced things. Flying around, lighting witches, briars from a fire stick that lights a barbecue. Anything advanced to see a miracle was a technology. But the Anunnaki believed in the creator of all. So they believed that their path and what they did on earth was part of that God's mission. So they had their own religion. And they didn't believe they themselves were gods. They just said it was okay for the humans to believe they were gods. It served their... Okay, over there, yes.
The text for Anana Church, what was that from?
Myths from Mesopotamia. Okay. Well, I believe the book is, it's a book that has a lot of the Mesopotamian myths, probably the same one that I got the Sargon from. I think it's just myths from Mesopotamia. But the author is off of my mind right now, I can't think of it. Any other questions? Okay.
One of the things that you probably know of people would be interested in, since you've mentioned Hammurabi, you Google the code of Hammurabi, read the prologue. It's a direct tie-in with all the Anunnaki, including Marduk.
Yes, also the Law Code of Hammurabi matches the Code of Moses a lot. An ox, a hand for hand, and if an ox, then we shall kill your ox. These are laws of codes, crimes and punishments. A lot of them are copied. I mentioned that some of Revelations is copied from the book of Noah, or Enoch. When Noah, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, Noah was born, he shined like a light. He shined so bright that his father asked to the wife, "Whose child is this? It can't be mine. This can't be child." Does that sound familiar to anybody? So the solution was, let's go to Methuselah, the oldest person who's living, and ask him. And he said, don't worry about this character Noah. He's going to be a savior to your civilization. He's a son of the sons of heaven. And the same thing was written about Jesus later. the same birth story. So one of the things I study is these birth stories. If you take a look in a horizontal fashion, let's say the New Testament, and look at the birth story of Jesus in two of the Gospels, because two of them do not describe it, two of them that talk about the birth stories have inconsistent stories. They don't match each other. If you look at the ending stories, some of them don't match each other. So what you do is you get the same part of the life of the person in each book. Instead of reading the whole thing, you just read the chapter that's about that issue. And what you find out is that they're not the same. Then they were copied incorrectly, or they were sourced places, so the stories are different. Yes?
I was wondering, did he study with the Native Americans? Because in our oral tradition and our creation stories, we tell coming from different stars that you have Jiblos mixing with the star people. You have the Holy, you have the Dakota. I mean, it goes on and on. It goes on.
He was aware of those very much. But the problem is that since it wasn't available in ancient text or tablet form, that was dug up and old, because it's the storytelling that's been carried on for thousands of years. There wasn't much he can do about it. So Zechariah the stuff that he could prove, and stuff that was in tablet form or in picture form.
Christians saying the Galatians was code written by early Christians to try to communicate to each other, and that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And then the relationship to Noah, do you know why people would have an interpretation that it was code?
Well, the book of Enoch, I used to have a set of 8 slides that copied on one side book of Enoch and one side book of Revelations, and it was word for word. But not every word, just the lines, just like we saw here. The story is different, but one line is the same. In the Revelations versus the Enoch story, you have lines and lines and pages that are literally the same. And in between is unique writing, which is unique to Revelations. But in between that is copied material. And it makes sense that in the year 0, whatever stories they've known for thousands of years are the stories that they know. And so those stories keep repeating themselves. Brothers that fight each other. Characters who die or thought to come back alive. We've seen stories of blood rivers and being born in secret and putting into baskets and being found to be... There's archetypes that Joseph Campbell wrote about that end up like in the Star Wars movies. The farm boy who's raised up to civilization, or the princess. All of these archetypes keep repeating themselves. Yes?
Why do you critics disagree or try to discredit Zechariah?
Because they cannot create a new paradigm on their own, of their own body of knowledge. And since they're stuck without creating something new, they turn to destroying something that's... This is a typical behavioral pattern of a debunker, or somebody they call a leveler. A leveler or aggressive, somebody who tries to depress down you or her to the level. Brings the intelligence down, brings the conversation down from the data, the evidence, to personal attacks. I met with Michael Heiser that Jason Martell mentioned. I scheduled him many years ago. And he said to me something like, well, there's this one word in here in Zach's book. Yeah, sort of was mistyped by the type. So what? Well, it's wrong. Okay, but that's a word out of 2,000 pages of material. Doesn't discount anything else. He even told me that all these plural terms are plural, except one term, one he didn't agree with. Them he agreed with, one he didn't. That was the basis of his argument. The basis of his argument of Sinner Sylvia 2/3 is it can't show the sun because the ancients didn't draw suns with rays of light coming off. Nobody ever did this in history. I mean, it's a stupid comment. Every kid drew it like this.
Yeah, I used to.
Me too. I said to him, just to hear it is incredible. Okay.
If you have more questions, I'm sure that Eric would be willing to stick around, maybe outside, so that we'll clear the room by the time that we get out of here. Thank you very much, Eric. It's great talk.
Thank you. I enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
My name is Jan Harzan. I'm the executive director for MUFON. We are a scientific research organization that basically collects sighting reports from the public and then goes and investigates them. Our mission statement as an organization is the scientific study of UFOs for the benefit of humanity. And we have 3 primary goals. We investigate UFO reports, we promote research into the UFO subject, and we educate the public on our findings.